This year, I was speaking at a church, and someone tapped me on the shoulder and they went, "Do you know Jim Lowe? Are you related to Jim Lowe?" It was that sort of accent. And I was like, oh, well, trying to nice way go, "I am Jim Lowe?" I thought, how do I phrase this to them? How do I say it subtly without offending the person? And I sort of went, "Oh, I am Jim Lowe." He went, "No, no, 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 I know you're Jim Lowe." He says, "But do you know Jim Lowe, the sheep farmer?" And I was like, "Jim Lowe, the sheep?" My granddad. And I'm named after my granddad, who's also called Jim Lowe. And this person who was sharing with me met my granddad in the 1960s and started telling me about my granddad. So I had a phone my dad, and I said, "Oh, by the way, I was speaking and someone started talking about your dad." And he goes, "Oh yeah," and he started to explain to me how my granddad was really respected in the sheep farming industry. Not something that I know much about, if I'm really honest with you. And it got me interested in my family tree. And my dad often, you know how parents sort of talk about stuff. He kept talking about family members, and I thought, let's have a listen out to see who he's talking about. Trying to find out what is truth, what is fiction. You know how stuff can get exaggerated. And he spoke about this guy in our family called William Forswood. He said, Sir William Forswood, he said, he was part build Liverpool Cathedral. And I'm thinking, yeah, whatever. So I quickly Googled this guy. And he had his own Wikipedia page. And I'm going, what? And I discovered that our great-great-great-granddad, he helped build Liverpool Cathedral. In fact, he's actually credited on a lot of sources as being one of the main guys behind the building of Liverpool Anglican Cathedral. And I'm like, why? Wow, even. I read about J.C. Ryle, the theologian. And this, my great-great-granddad was mates with him. He helped build Liverpool Cathedral with him as part of the guys to raise the money for it. And it really amazed me, because a couple of days earlier, I'd been looking on Facebook, and some people had written about how they had amazing experiences at Liverpool Cathedral. And I'm like, wow, my great-great-granddad was part of that legacy that God has used, and God used him in incredible ways. But then I started asking my dad some more questions about our family members. And there was another couple of family members who had some Wikipedia pages. My grand's cousins. So my dad gives me one of their books and says, "Jim, have a read of this book." And the front cover, this is the summary of the story. It says this: "This book charts the loves and the lives of three sisters, all of them strikingly beautiful, artistic and wild, and who inspired and seduced some of the greatest artists and writers of the 20th century." I would keep reading the descriptions, but it wouldn't be appropriate for church, okay, to describe them. To describe them compared to the Kardashians, they made the Kardashians look like nuns. They were extreme, their behavior and what they got up to. And I'm thinking it's incredible in my family tree how we have some God bringing great glory through the building of a Liverpool Cathedral, but then we have the scandals and some of them getting shot and having affairs and all sorts of things. And I thought, all of us maybe have a few skeletons in our family. And in Matthew chapter 1, Matthew, when he tells the Christmas story and the story of Jesus coming to earth, he starts with Jesus' family tree, with his genealogy. Now, this wouldn't have been the place that I would normally start if I was telling Jesus' story. And actually, it's the sort of thing that I skip through really quickly. But Matthew, first of all, he wants to write this family tree because he's trying to show the Jewish audience who are reading his letter how Jesus is the Messiah they've been waiting for. But also, I think he wants to show that God chose a very ordinary, messed up family to bring his plan of salvation. And God wasn't looking for perfection. He was looking for real. In the story of Jesus' genealogy, when you read through it, the first few verses of Matthew's Gospel, you see 4 women who are mentioned. Now, it wasn't very common to mention women in genealogies, and especially the fact that these 4 women were mentioned in Jesus' family tree is a bit strange. Because the 4 women that were mentioned in Jesus' family tree were not the people you would emphasize, you would show off. They weren't building great buildings or cathedrals. They were involved in scandals. Or even worse than that, they were non-Jews, which for the Jewish audience would have been like, oh, moment. You had Tamar, who, to cut a long story short, ends up dressing as a prostitute to seduce her father-in-law to get pregnant. Bad story. You've got Rahab, who was a prostitute, who helped the Israelites capture Jericho. She's also, both her and Tamar were non-Jews. You then had Ruth, who was a really good lady, but she was a non-Jew. You then had Bathsheba mentioned, and Bathsheba, she had an affair with King David, and her husband got killed because of her affair with King David. Not exactly the story you'd emphasize. Then as you read through the men, you find out they were liars. They were men who seduced prostitutes. They were men who killed people. They were men who were dictators. They were men who worshipped idols. And you're thinking, why does God mention all these people in his family tree? And I've been thinking about this. Why? You know, 1 Corinthians 1 verse 27, I think, can point us to the answer. It says, God chose the world, the things the world considers foolish, in order to shame those who think they are wise. And he chose things that are powerless to shame those who are powerful. You know, as we start the story of Christmas, we've got to realize this. The story of Christmas wasn't a perfect story. We all know it wasn't a perfect story. But it had messed up people in the story. Didn't go how you'd plan your perfect birth. But it's a real story. It's a story that shows that God cares about real people. It's a story that shows that God actually cares about people who society often shuns and pushes to the side. I don't know about you, but I know myself in the past, I've had a lot of unconscious bias. Even now, I'll probably have some unconscious bias in my life. I've used certain people and ruled them out from being part of God's plan because of their situations or their stories. But as I start reading Matthew's Gospel and the story of Jesus' birth, I see that no one is excluded from God's story. That no one is excluded for playing a part in God's story. That whatever anyone's ethnic background, whatever their sexual sins, whatever the mistakes they've made, the murders they've committed, whatever they've done, they can still play a part in God's story. And there's redemption, and there's forgiveness, and there's a fresh start. And it challenges me, because how often have I maybe in the past judged someone and thought they were excluded from God's plan because they didn't fit my idea of who God uses. And it challenges me that with all my faults, I can still be used by God, because he uses foolish things. That's why he uses me. And as we start the season of Advent, I want to encourage us. Number one, never write anybody off. Because God never wrote anybody off. And that is why he came to the earth, so that all of us can have a relationship with him. So I can't write anyone off. But I also need, as well as not writing anyone else off, I also mustn't write myself off. You mustn't write yourself off. God still wants to use you. God wants you to play a part in his plan. There's nothing that can exclude you from his plan. Nothing is beyond forgiveness. Nothing is beyond a fresh chance. God wants to use you even though you failed in the past, even though you've made mistakes, even though you've acted like a fool. So guys, as we hit this Christmas season, who can we encourage? Who maybe do we not need to exclude from God? What unconscious bias do we need to get rid of in our lives? Because you know what? God wants to use us and wants to use people who the world considers foolish.